we're going to attempt to make something that's already pretty good a little better. If you haven't seen these before, Twinkly makes addressable RGB Christmas lights, and that's what these are. So what that means is each of the bulbs can be a different color, different intensity, turn on and off at different times. If you carry that sort of forward, you can imagine different patterns and different effects that you can create, all from an app on your phone. There are a couple drawbacks, however, thus why we have this video. So let's get this open and figure out what we need to do to make it better, or what's wrong with it. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. So this set I got comes with what they call string and dots. So strings are what you think of with traditional Christmas lights, just a big long string of lights. And dots, they're a little bit different, but we'll cover that more later on in the video. For now, we'll focus on the strings. So we'll get these open. We'll promptly file the paperwork in the trash can. I don't know that I've read any of these things before, but that may show in my ability to make things better and make things. I'll let you decide that. But these lights have sort of a fundamental problem. The old traditional Christmas lights, you could just daisy chain quite a few of them together and make one big, long, giant string. Well, you can't really do that with the Twinkly lights. So let's see if we can get this package open. They've got the power supply sort of jammed in this cardboard box, and you've got to sort of break it apart in order to get the supply out. Why they did that, I'm not too sure. There's a little perforated strip that goes down the middle of it, but there you have it. And some of you may already have sort of seen the biggest problem is the power supply. It's huge. So if you think of putting these things outside and wanting to have more than just a set or two, just the size of your bundle of cords and power supplies. And we look at this one. It's a 24-volt supply, 1.5 amp, and once you get it all together, as you can see, this is a pretty long power supply arrangement. You can't just plug that in anywhere. You either have to get little tiny extension cords so you can fit in a power strip, but it's just a mess. And then also you'll see that the lights aren't one big continuous string. It's split into two separate strings. This is what they call a string 400. So you've got two bundles of 200 connected to the controller. And this kind of creates a problem because when you go to put them on a tree or a bush or whatever, all of these are connected. So you can't just sort of run the string, connect another set of lights to it, then connect another set of lights to it. It doesn't work at all like the traditional Christmas lights of the past. So what we're going to do is cut this thing apart. So now get one last good look at it, because this is going to get a little messy. And here we go. Power cord, chop. And now we can probably throw this thing away because it's a giant mess. So let's take our power wire and we'll just strip off the insulation to sort of prep it for a connector. So we'll get the insulation stripped off and basically just get it ready for a new connector. Because we're going to take a computer style power supply and make it so we can plug multiples of these strings in from one power supply. We're lucky here, they use red and black. Sometimes they don't. I've taken apart other Twinkly light sets, and sometimes the colors aren't what we would expect for a DC setup. So we're going to cut off the light strings, and as you can see, those are just two wires braided. I'm not going to go into any detail in this video about how the lights are, what the data being sent to the lights is and how it's decoded and that. But all the information is traveling on just those two wires. And really all we're doing at this point is we're installing connectors on each of these wires that we cut, so that the strings are so we're just more flexible. So you don't have everything sort of tied together in one big giant piece. And for these, I'm using Molex Minifit Junior connectors. As you can see, I've got a problem. I like connectors, and I've got a wide variety of trays just like this, full of other connectors. So they come in handy, but I think I've gone a little bit overboard, maybe. But anyway, that's my problem, not yours. So let's see if I can find my crimpers. Oh, yeah, camera shakes. I need to work on that. Well, let's see if I can zoom in too much and make it not focus. That'll make a great video. It'll be really informative when you can't see what's going on or not going on. So. All right, so you can see it's just two wires for each of the sets of strings. So power and data are transmitted on these two conductors. And all you need to do is just kind of strip them back a little bit. It's an interesting wire. It's all one piece, but it's twisted like that. So we'll just strip the ends a little bit, and you'll notice one of the conductors is copper colored, one of them is just tin colored. So make sure to sort of keep that polarity when you wire your connectors. And in this case, I always do copper towards the locking tab. Now, some of the connectors don't have a locking tab in that orientation, but just try and be consistent. And my plan for all of these is to basically modify all of my lights so that all of the sort of types of lights are color coded with the connectors, so that there won't be any confusion as to what goes where. One thing important about these lights is that the number of lights in the string is important. The Twinkly controller knows how many lights there are. So the way these LEDs work, essentially there's a separate data signal that is passed to the lights, and it essentially tells each of the LEDs what to do. So the first LED sort of gets the data, and it sort of strips its information out and then passes the rest along down the line to the next LED and so forth. So the controller needs to know how many LEDs there are in the string in order to send enough sort of data pulses to control them all. So that's where with these, at least with Twinkly, you can't manipulate the number of LEDs that they control. So I've just made it a point to sort of color code and set up connectors such that they match the controller itself. So if it's a 600 string, it's going to be on a 600 controller versus a 400 versus any other type controller. Additionally, in what I figured out thus far with these, is that there are two different voltages. As we'll see later on, the dots are a 5-volt system, and the string is a 24-volt system. So that'll be something that's important, and also part of my sort of connector coding to prevent plugging them into the wrong power supply. As you see here, we're just going to crimp on a couple connectors, and my camera won't focus on the right thing, but I guess there are worse things in the world. But we'll get those crimped, and I'll show you here in a second how everything sort of hooks together. These little crimpers, Molex, I've got sort of the cheap $30 or whatever crimpers that you get off Amazon. They don't do that great of a job. They're okay, but those Molex crimpers are expensive. I wouldn't say that they're worth it, but they do a much better job. So as you can see here, I put the copper up toward the locking tab. And sometimes getting these little, with these little wires, getting them jammed in, may need to use a screwdriver or something, but once it's in, give it a final little twist, and that string is sort of ready to go. So we'll do the same thing with the other one. Get it all crimped up. That's a better shot with the focus for sure. And maybe I spoke too soon. Alright, the LED side is just about done. Get the pins twisted around the right way so it will go into the connector easily. So now we do the same thing on the controller end. Basically just the the opposite connector and the opposite pin. Since they're the same wires, same color, same setup, that's all the same. And we'll, any day now, right? Get these crimped together, or crimped. And all these connectors and that I've ordered from Digikey. Been buying from them for many, many years. Have no affiliation whatsoever with them. They probably wouldn't want to claim me if they were given the option, but always had fantastic service and pretty much any part that you can possibly imagine, electronic wise, they've got it. And I'll put links in the description for all of these pieces and parts. These are just what I use. There are a wide variety of connectors and that you could use instead. But I'll put in the description details as to the exact components I used in this setup. So on the power side, going to do a slightly different connector. It's still going to be a Minifit Junior, but it's going to be a different color. The strings, like I said before, this is a 24 volt system. So the power supplies we're going to set up such that 24 volt is one connector and 5 volts another, and that they won't be interchangeable. So you couldn't accidentally plug in the 24 power supply into a 5 volt string or 5 volt light setup. So for the 24 volt, I'm using a white 2-pin, but the locking tab is in the middle. So you can see, well, I can't see very well. So much for autofocus. But essentially, same pins, just a different configuration. And we'll get these stripped, and for this end, because it doesn't terminate well, I'm going to put a small piece of heat shrink around the wire first, just to bring it as close as possible to the connector, so that we don't have sort of that transition from the insulation over the two conductors to the conductors exposed. And this heat shrink is cheap Amazon heat shrink, like so forth. I'll put in the description all the pieces and parts and stuff that I used. Not to try and push it or whatever. I've just found it easier in just my research of things and trying to sort of figure out what works best. If people sort of include that detailed information, it just makes it easier for the next guy to find pieces that work the first time, instead of ordering 12 different things and it not working out. Alright, so get this connector on, get these pins lined up. Well, if I can. Alright, there it goes. So we will get a heat source. So I'm just using a hot air pencil from my soldering station, and since it's a small piece of heat shrink, it'll do that pretty quick. So now there you have a controller that you can just disconnect from the system. So if you think about when you're installing these lights, having these sort of there'll be four total individual pieces being able to be separated makes it significantly easier to sort of untangle, to just to manage. It makes it a lot simpler. And so now we're just going to sort of rewire the power supply. The adapters I bought are 24 volt, and they're for like 5 amps or so. But we're just going to solder on 3 connectors, make it so it can run 3 strings of LEDs. That way I'm well under the power requirements for the light strings, and still got enough juice. Worst case, I could add a couple Y adapters and run several more connectors on it. And basically all we're chopping off the ends and soldering on new ones. And these were power supplies I got off Amazon. Schnit power, or whatever it is. It's probably closer to shit power, but I guess we'll find out when these things are in use how long they last. But I don't see any reason why they won't have a good long life. They're not being overdriven, and they're only going to be used sort of during Christmas time and sort of other like that. So all I'm doing is cutting off the barrel connector, and we're just going to solder sort of new pigtails, with new wire and crimp on new connectors. So I'll fast forward through this because we've seen this a million times before, and I don't think anybody wants to see it again. Alright, so now for some soldering. All we're doing is going from 3 to 1, and we're just going to solder these wires together. So get my iron fired up, and we'll get these tinned to make it easier to connect them once the heat shrink is on. And also so we don't get the wires too overheated, so that we start shrinking the heat shrink before we're actually ready to solder. Okay, let's see if we can get these lined up. And let's zoom out a little bit. This is this heat shrink is adhesive lined, so when it melts, it's got kind of a glue in it that just seals the joint a little better, possibly preventing moisture from getting in. These are going to be used in outdoor environment, but in waterproof boxes designed sort of for this purpose. So I don't think there'll be too much issue in it getting wet or anything like that. So we get the red wire soldered together. And there we go. Get the heat shrink on it. And all we want to do is make sure that there's no way for the wires to touch each other. The heat shrink doesn't need to be perfect. As you can tell, it's a little bit short to begin with because of the wire bundle we're making. But in the end, this will be more than good enough. I think my hot air needs to be a little bit hotter. And my camera needs to be a little bit less wobbly. So just slide the outer heat shrink over the entire mess, and we'll get that sealed up, and then we're ready to go. This time we'll use a little bit bigger heat gun. because it'll take forever with that little hot air pencil. If you can't tell, this is a cordless DeWalt heat gun. I'm not terribly impressed with it. Um, I've got I don't know how old it is, but a crappy Tower Hobbies heat gun that I've had forever that just, obviously it's corded, but it just uh, knocks the socks off of this DeWalt. The DeWalt doesn't output too much air. I mean, it's hot, but its output is not significant. Uh, you certainly couldn't use this thing for paint stripping or anything where you really needed a large amount of heat. It just it just can't do it. Heat shrink, it's fine. As you can see, I mean, it's still taking a little while to do with uh, the heat shrink with the DeWalt 20 volt heat gun. But that's it. The power supply is now ready. All right, so let's test these out. Make sure it still works, or make sure it works. So I'm just going to plug in the new power supply to one of the controllers, and it's best to plug in the power supply to the controller prior to plugging in the power supply. Uh, there's a pretty big inrush current, and uh, if you just plug in with the system energized with the little Molex connectors, it makes a pretty healthy spark. So you may erode them over time. But everything looks like it's working. Uh, so right now it's just on a default sort of white, I forget what they call the pattern, but it's almost like a fireworks kind of a look to it. It's a good idea to label the controllers. There's no marking on them that indicates what they actually are. So in this case, it's a string 400. So I like to print labels and just stick it on the controller so I know for sure how many LEDs it's meant to control. Uh, Even though the connectors are color coded in that, uh, just sort of a nice to have just in case something gets mixed up. So this way you can see the effects a little better. So you can imagine this, unwound. Uh, just what it would look like. So let's test by adding another string 400 set to the power supply. Just make sure everything is working as expected. And that looks good. So like I said before, the way I set it up, or the way I picked the power supply, it was such that it would replace 3 of the factory power supplies. I didn't do any current measurements just to see how far I could push it. I just made sure I stayed within the published rating of the original power supply to the lights. Alright, so let's get these out of the way and let's do a comparison. So here are 3 of the factory power supplies, and with the design of these, I mean, you pretty much you can't plug it into an extension cord, so you'd have to use a power strip of some sort, and you wouldn't necessarily want to use that outside. I suppose they sell waterproof versions, but or water resistant. But all those three are replaced by that box. So with a normal power cord and being plugged in, much more flexible. I mean, literally flexible, in that you can bend the wire different directions versus the sort of the hard plastic connector on the original power supplies, and it just makes it a much better arrangement. Before I made these changes, I had quite a few lights outside. They were all in large outdoor electrical boxes, basically just snapped together. But many of them were tough to fit because of so many of those Twinkly power supplies. This method fixes that. Now onto the dots. So as I said before, they're a little bit different. In this case, these are 5 volt, and it really just the light configuration is different than what we sort of normally expect from Christmas lights. Also a difference in this is the lights are a 3-wire arrangement. So essentially all we're going to do for the dots is cut off the power connector, cut off the connector to or cut off the wire to the lights, install 3-pin connector for the light string, and basically make an adapter for the USB connector. So we can run it off a similar laptop type power supply, that configuration, or we can run it off of sort of normal USB power supply. So it's the exact same process as before. Going to cut, install connectors, label it so that we know what it's for, and really that's about it. So I'll speed up the video for this process because it's basically the same thing over again, but just those slight differences that I mentioned before. As you can see here, one of the conductors has like a copper sort of marker in the braid, and just need to make sure that we line those up when we do the connectors. So I'll speed this up, and then I'll show the finished version at the end. Alright, so we'll test different colors with the dots, and everything's looking good. And as I said before, this is essentially the same thing as the string. We've just made it more portable. So you could conceivably wrap the lights around a small tree and railing something, and you don't have as big of a tangled mess when you go to take the lights down with the connectors like this. So there you have it. Dots. Alright, there you have it. Now we're on to the last twinkly lights that we're going to cover in this video, and that's the twinkly line. The line is a 5-volt system as well as, just like the dots, but in this case you can specify either 80 or 90, or I'm sorry, 90 or 180 LEDs in the string, so you can control it in the app. So conceivably you could buy a twinkly line, and then you could add additional LEDs to it if you didn't want to use the line strips that come with it. Searching Amazon, as I always do, there are a variety of addressable LED strips that can be used with Twinkly, and I ordered a few different sets just to do some experimenting and figure out what does and doesn't work. So in this case, I've taken one of those sets and I've cut it down from 100 to 90 and made it so that I can connect one or two of them together. With the line, another 3-wire arrangement for the LEDs. The red wire is not positive. The blue wire is actually positive, red is negative, and yellow is data. So before you connect anything or make any changes, be sure to test the wiring on your lights just to make sure you know what wires are what. Obviously, if you maintain colors, there shouldn't be a problem. But when interfacing with sort of unknown light strips from Amazon or other sources, just do some testing to make sure what's what, so you don't burn up your controller. This process is the exact same as it was earlier with the dots and string. So I'll skip over a lot of that and show you the finished product. Alright, so let's test the line. And as you can see, I made a connector to interface with the original line setup. The line is an adhesive backed, sort of like a silicone covered LED strip with magnets in it also, so you can stick the strip to ferrous metals. The magnets aren't super strong and they're pretty wide spaced, but it will hold itself to like a refrigerator, you know, along those lines. So that appears to be working well. So now let's test it with some of the other strips that I made for it. These, like I said before, I'll have Amazon affiliate links in the description. A couple different styles here. All compatible with Twinkly for the most part. So with that purple spool and sort of the opaque white spool, you can see these lighting up now. The issue I discovered on some of these strings is that red and green are switched. So if you told this string to light up red, it would light up green. Not the most ideal, but depending on the situation you're using them, certainly not a deal breaker. I'll leave notes in the description as to the strings that were wired correctly versus incorrectly for Twinkly compatibility, because to my knowledge you cannot change sort of red and green around like that in the app. You could certainly do custom colors, so you could have it output correctly to match other light strings, but you'd have to switch red and green around. That's the only drawback so far. And it looks like these manufacturers of these LEDs have different standards for red, green, blue versus blue, green, red, and so forth. These I've found to have red and green switched around. So now one last string of lights before we go. So this one's a little bit different in that we're using much higher powered LEDs. So effectively we're going to use this LED strip, we're going to power it from the power supply, and we're going to use the data line from the Twinkly controller to control the lights. So I've added connectors here. Basically, we want to share the ground, so we have a common ground with the Twinkly controller and the power supply. And we're going to plug the negative and the data line into the Twinkly controller. Then we plug in the negative and our plus 5 volts to the power supply. And now the Twinkly controller can switch a much greater load, meaning we can run much higher power LEDs and we won't fry our Twinkly controller. So in this scenario, you could conceivably, as large or high a current strip as you could find, you could conceivably run it from the Twinkly controller, just by the addition of a separate power supply line. So the Twinkly controller and the LEDs are plugged into the power supply individually. And then see, once I turn it on here, there they go. These lights behave just as if they were twinkly lights. It doesn't know the difference. But you want to make sure that the ground line is shared. And that's it. That may be a long-winded way to get to, well, we just changed a couple connectors on some Christmas lights. But that's essentially what we did. The factory arrangement, the power supplies are large, and really they're not very flexible. In order to fit several in a small space, you simply can't do it. So replacing the factory supplies with a more of a computer type power supply configuration makes it so you can fit these things in outdoor boxes or something along those lines when you use them in the snow and rain.